like to go ahead and be opening your Bibles to Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1 is where we'll begin our study this morning as we focus our attention on the book of Philippians. We've worked through the New Testament up until this point, and we are continuing on that journey. I want to pause, before we dive into Philippians and encourage you to remember the Friends and Family Day that we'll have here at Chisholm Hills next week. There is also scheduled to be an Antonio's Grill that day too, and so we invite you to invite your friends and your family to be with us to worship. That's the primary thing, but also to enjoy fellowship and to get to know our family here at Chisholm Hills like you know them. We would like to encourage you not just to invite your friends and family, but invite your friends and family that don't go to church somewhere else. You know, find somebody that you work with that doesn't go to church anywhere and invite them to be with us here at Chisholm Hills. I know that they'll love our family just like you do. Philippians chapter 1 is where we'll focus our attention this morning. The idea is a life worth living and a death worth dying. Obviously, you could probably guess which verse the theme that we'll study this morning comes from. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 21, where Paul says, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." In 2003, there was a man named Aaron Ralston. He was going to climb the Blue John Canyon, a place where he frequented. He was a well-known rock climber in the area. This comes from his book, Between a Rock and a Hard Place, an autobiography that he wrote. And you'll understand why Aaron Ralston wrote the biography when I tell you this story of the autobiography. He was climbing that day in the Blue John Canyon, and his arm was stuck between two rocks. He was not able to get himself out of the rocks, and so there he found himself pretty much in a big predicament. And the fact that he was in this remote location led to the fact that he couldn't call anyone. There was no cell phone signal. There was no way that he was going to be able to reach out to anyone to let them know that he was stuck between the two rocks. And Mr. Ralston says that he was there for 5 days. 5 days stuck between the rock with his arm, couldn't get it free, and he was trying to decide what he was going to do. And this obviously was probably a pretty exhausting 5 days, not just that you're staying 5 days in the wilderness in a remote location, but your arm is stuck between two rocks. And finally, after 5 days, he decided to use his multi-tool and cut off his arm. Was able to get back to his vehicle and then get to a hospital and then lives to tell the story about it today. He's written an autobiography called Between a Rock and a Hard Place. It's an incredible book and a great story. But I tell you that story to tell you this, that we'll do great things. We'll go to great extents to make sure that we live. We'll go through all kinds of medical procedures. We'll change our diet. We'll pay close attention to how we're living or what we're doing because we will go to great extents to make sure that we live. We'll do crazy things in life to make sure that we'll live. Dare I say that we would do things that people would say are insane to live, like what Mr. Ralston did by cutting off his arm just to ensure that he could get back to his vehicle and hopefully make it to the hospital. He was willing to take that chance just so that he could live. Now, when I read that story and I think of other things or maybe other remarkable stories that we've heard that people have tried to do in order to ensure that they live, it makes me question sometimes what those people really are living for. I don't know if Mr. Ralston was a Christian. He doesn't claim any allegiance to Jesus in his book. I don't know if some of these other people that will do remarkable things in order to ensure that they live are Christians, but me, I want to know, and maybe you too, why am I living? What am I living for? What is it that fuels me to go to great extents to live? Is it just because I want to prolong my life here on the earth? Is it just because I want to see my kids grow up? Is it just because I want to see, something else happen? Maybe LSU beat Alabama one more time or something like that. I'm holding out hope for something, right? What is it that I'm living for? And I think Philippians 1 gives us an answer to that question. And not just an answer to that question, but I also think Paul sets a precedent of what it is that we're dying for too. And death is a scary thought. It's not just something that we accept. It's a reality that haunts our lives all the time. And it doesn't matter how often it happens, how many times we deal with it in our lives. It's just a reality we never get used to. And Paul talks a little bit about both, how to live and what it's worth and what it's for, and how to die and what it's worth and what it's for. And I want to focus on that this morning as we consider Philippians chapter 1 in verse number 21, and really the verses that surround it. When Paul was writing the book at Philippians, this is one of his prison epistles, right? So he's imprisoned at the time that he's writing this letter. And his desire that he really had was to come to the church at Philippi. And he wanted to encourage them and he wanted to build them up, but he couldn't, obviously, because he was incarcerated. And so he writes this letter to them, and he basically uses these words to encourage them, to spur them along to greater faithfulness. And the church at Philippi, I don't think, was struggling with anything bad. You know, sometimes when he writes to, like, for example, the 1st and 2nd Corinthians, to the church at Corinth, there were some evil and wicked things happening in Corinth. Or like last week when we looked at Galatians, he says in Galatians, or rather Ephesians last week, but the week before Galatians, and he says in verse number 10 of chapter 1, I'm amazed that you're so soon removed from the gospel. And so obviously there were these false teachers that were coming in and were telling them different stories than what Paul had told them or what the gospel had revealed, and he was amazed. There's no such thing in Philippians. The church at Philippi is never condemned for anything that they're doing wrong. Now, there are some false teachers that are trying to press in on them, and Paul addresses that right here in chapter 1. But regardless, the church at Philippi is nothing but commended. They're a good church. And Paul writes to them to encourage them to keep on doing what they're doing. Now, the reason why Paul spends so much time encouraging them, though, is because of the care and concern that they have for him. They know that he's incarcerated, and they know that he wants to be there with them, and they know that he's not in ideal circumstances, and so they have a great care and concern for him. He even praises them for wanting to send money to help him to get to them. I mean, this is a great church, okay? And so what Paul does is write to them, not because there was something wrong or some big issue that needed to be worked out in the church at Philippi, but he wanted to encourage them to keep on living the way that they were living, and for the reason they were living, for Jesus Christ, and to keep on modeling that by the way that they care. Whoa, wake up, boys, if you're asleep. I don't know what happened, but man, that's how much emphasis we want to put on it, right? That Paul wanted to praise them. He wanted to praise them because they were living out the will of Jesus Christ. And as they pursued that life on their way to death, inevitably it was going to happen. They would glorify God in their death. When you start to look at the chapter, at least the context, it really begins back up in verse number 12. The first 11 verses or so is Paul introducing the book, much like we have noticed in each study that we've had in the New Testament. This greeting or salutation that Paul uses, it's pretty traditional. He usually thanks them and praises them and prays for them, and that's what happens. But in verse number 12, he dives right into the subject, and he's telling them about the advances of the gospel and how the gospel has gone on even while he's in prison. In fact, I'm so thankful that when you read verses 12 through 15, he even says that it's become known, verse 13, that the whole imperial guard and everyone else, because of my imprisonment, they know Jesus Christ. That's what he says in verse number 12, that what has happened to me, being in prison, it's actually advanced the gospel. You can't stop God's word from being spread. Even if you put me in chains, I'm still going to tell the people about Jesus. He used his prison as a platform, as a pulpit, to tell other people about Jesus. And there's not many folks that can say they did that as effectively as Paul. And he tells the church, I'm so thankful that I'm here. How many of us could say that? I'm thankful that I'm in this negative or bad or hard situation because it's a situation where I can show other people about Jesus. Yea, verse 13, the imperial guard. All of the soldiers that were there carrying to Paul, they knew about Jesus, right? Read on, verse 14. Most of the brothers have gained confidence in the Lord from my imprisonment and dare even more to speak the word boldly or fearlessly about Jesus. Now, here are the bad people in verse number 15. There are some that are preaching Christ out of envy and rivalry or envy and strife, but there are others that do it out of goodwill. And these are preaching out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. And then he goes back to the ones that are preaching out of envy and strife. And he says they proclaim Jesus out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, thinking that they will cause me trouble in my imprisonment. In other words, Paul says, listen, they're just trying to make it hard on all of us. They're trying to lead other people astray. They're really only preaching because it attracts crowds and popularity. They're preaching because of selfish ambition, not sincere motives in their preaching Christ. Verse number 18, but what does it matter, Paul says? Only that in every way, Whether a man is preaching from false motives or if he's up there sincerely preaching his heart out, look what he says in verse number 18. Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice. Yes, I will continue to rejoice. Paul says, as long as the gospel of Jesus is broadcasted out to people, I don't care so much about the man. He says some people, they don't preach with the right motives, but if Jesus is being preached and lives are being changed, that's what I rejoice in. So here's what I would like to do this morning. I would like to focus on this issue right here. To live is Christ and to die is gain, because that's where Paul's building up. He's rejoicing in the fact that Jesus is being preached, and he leads up to this great pinnacle in chapter 1 where all of this preaching the gospel led him to believe that to live for Jesus Christ, it's the greatest thing ever. And if he did die, if that was his reality in that moment, then that was okay too, because of the gospel, because of what it had done in his life, it had changed his view. Here's what I would like to operate on, at least a phrase that I would like for us to operate on. I'm fixing to throw this clicker. That's about 3 weeks in a row. It doesn't change the slide, right? Here is our key verse. Go ahead, Philip, to the next one. I believe this morning that there is no gain in your death if there's no Christ in your life. I might even say, and I thought about this on the way up here, what I should have written on that slide is, if Christ is not your life, there is no gain in your death. Because some people, they have Christ in their life, I guess, but he's not their life. He doesn't mean the most to them. And I think what Paul is saying, and ultimately will prove to the church at Philippi, that if Jesus Christ is not your life, there is no gain in your death. Let's look at two things that happens in Philippians chapter 1 that I want to challenge you this morning that will help make Christ your life. Here's idea number one, Philip, his desire. As we look at Paul's desire, ultimately that text builds up to the fact that what he wanted more than anything in the world was to magnify Jesus Christ. He even says that later on in the text. If you look down at verse number 20, he says, my eager expectation and my hope is not that I will be ashamed about anything. And of course, being in prison was probably a shameful thing for most, but Paul says, I'm not. It's a platform for me to show you the hope that I have in Jesus. But look at this. But now, as always with courage, Christ will be highly honored, or your Bibles might say, magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. Now, what Paul does, I think, in verses 18 through 21 is give us a few reasons or a few ways that you and I can magnify Christ. If that really is our desire, and I hope it is, I hope that's what we want to do with our lives today, to make our death become a gain, these things must be present in our life. Our desire to magnify Christ, it begins, number one, with rejoicing. Rejoicing always, Philippians 4 and verse number 4. Even in verse number 18 of chapter 1, Paul says, in this we rejoice consistently or constantly. Yes, verse 18, I will continue to rejoice. And I like how he ends that section, because all the way up until this point, from verse 12 onward till you get to verse 18, what you see is a constant reminder of Paul's present reality, which, by the way, is in prison. Okay? And it's less than ideal circumstances. It's not pleasant. And Paul reminds them of that. And elsewhere in the book of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and even later to Timothy, he talks about the difficulties of the experiences that he had for Jesus, but he never regrets any of them. And he never says, I want to take those back and I want to change them. It's just that I'm proud I got to do that so other people could see the hope that I had in Jesus and the things that Jesus provided to me. And Paul constantly did model this mindset of rejoicing constantly. As he writes to them, he tells them, listen, it doesn't matter what the present looks like because I know what the future looks like. We sing that song. I don't know about today, essentially, is the message, but I know about tomorrow because I know who holds tomorrow. I know who holds the future. And that's what Paul was exclaiming to them. It really doesn't matter how bleak and dark the circumstances look today because the future is as bright as the Son of God. When I look at verse 18 and I see how Paul concludes that section, right? This section of I'm in prison and it's difficult, but hey, it's okay because I'm telling other people about Jesus. You see this mindset of rejoicing. And people ask all the time, at least one of the questions that's been coming up lately is, about raising kids in this progressively difficult world. how the world is progressing more and more toward difficulty. And I do wonder about that sometimes. Like, what's it going to be like for Drake when he's 16 or maybe 20? What's it going to be like as the world progresses into this? How are you going to handle that? How are you going to handle difficult times? And maybe you have a plan, or maybe you don't. I don't know that I have a plan. I guess I'm just going to have to wait and see how it is when I get there. I'm not sure. But I think Paul would say, rejoice in Jesus. Because even in the most difficult times, he says that's what magnifies Jesus. The great culmination in Philippians chapter 1 is right there in verse 20 and 21. To magnify Jesus, to live for him, and to die for him. And it all culminates, or at least it begins to culminate with this right here, being able to rejoice in difficult circumstances. And did you know that's always been a theme with God's people? Rejoicing in difficult circumstances. Here are I can't add. Here are two of my favorite passages. The reason I did that is because it's in Habakkuk 3, all right? Two of my favorite passages about rejoicing in difficult times. Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 17 through 20. Here you find Habakkuk, who was a confused man. He really walked around with a head like a question mark. He always asked God questions. He was trying to figure out how to navigate difficult circumstances. And in Habakkuk chapter 3, he had no food in his fields. He had nothing good going for him. He had no herd in his stalls. Yet Habakkuk's message was, I will rejoice in the Lord. What about Job? In Job chapter 1 and verse number 20, after we're told that Job loses everything that's dear to him, he still says, blessed be the name of the Lord. That's the theme of God's people from the beginning of time. Rejoice constantly. Here's way number 2. You can magnify Christ in your life. You can rely completely on Jesus Christ. Look at verse number 19. Because I know this will lead to my salvation. That's why Paul says, I can rejoice right now in these dark present circumstances, whatever that might look like in your life. I can do that because I know the bright future that I have. But read on in verse 19. Through your prayers and help from the Spirit of Jesus Christ. Now, what I like about verse 19 is something that we don't really talk about a whole lot, I guess because we're scared to navigate it or don't really know how to discuss it. But Paul essentially admits to the church at Philippi that he relied heavily on the sufficiency of the Holy Spirit, that he relied heavily on the comfort that it brought through the revelation of God. What he revealed about God's mind brought Paul comfort, that it could get him through whatever circumstance that he felt or that he faced, something that was difficult for Paul. It really wasn't that difficult at all because he could rely on what the Spirit was revealing from God. And so can we, right? That's why Paul writes to the church at Corinth about the God of all comfort and the Spirit that revealed the mind of the God of all comfort so that you and I can confidently face difficult situations just like Paul. And we too can say, through the prayers of our brothers and sisters, like he does in verse 19, and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, we too can rejoice in difficult circumstances. But there's other things right here in verse number 19 that catch my attention. In the CSB that I'm reading, it says, because I know this will lead to my salvation, but some of your Bibles might say, this might lead to my deliverance. And when you read that word or read that phrase, a lot of commentators suggest that Paul was looking back to Job 13 and verse number 16 when he says, this will lead to my deliverance, because Job says something like this, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. And what Job is saying essentially is, I know that these difficult circumstances are leading me to something better, that God is going to deliver me from this. Even though I can't see what it is right now, and even though I don't understand how it's unfolding, I know that God is leading me toward that. And commentators suggest that Paul was borrowing from that language in Job 13 and verse number 16. But I think it's a little bit short-sighted if we only think that Paul's talking about getting out of prison in verse 19. And I think that some of these more modern translations that translate the word salvation instead of deliverance, it really paints the bigger picture. That Paul says, essentially, what he's thinking is, what the issue is Paul plans on being sustained. He plans on being vindicated. He knows that what's happening right now, it's all going to be made right. All the wrongs of life are going to be made right. Whether or not he gets out of prison in this physical life, he still believes with all of his heart that everything would be made right. Do you know how I know that? Do you know what could make Paul say that? It wasn't just because of the prayers of his brothers and sisters. It was because he relied completely on the Spirit of Jesus Christ, or at least God. You could put all three together, but in his words, help from the Spirit. He relied completely on God. Here's verse number 20. Way number 3 that you can magnify Christ. You can represent. Since we've added C words to every one, rejoice constantly, rely completely, represent courageously. It takes courage to do what Paul did. Look at verse 20. My eager expectation and hope is that I will not be ashamed about anything, but as always with courage, Christ will be magnified or highly honored in my body, whether by life or by death. Now we read the word hope, I guess. My eager expectation and hope. And I guess the way that we use that, I said something about LSU beating Alabama, right, earlier. My hope is that LSU beats Alabama, but usually those hopes are dashed. They're not so much an eager expectation as they are this genuine hope. I mean, it's really just a shot in the dark, I guess you could say. Or maybe that it doesn't rain this afternoon or something like that. We say we hope that doesn't happen. But what Paul is talking about really is a deep-seated confidence. It's this deep-rooted assurance. He's not uncertain at all. There is not one ounce of uncertainty in Paul's heart. He knows with extreme confidence and supreme understanding that he will represent Jesus regardless of what happened to him. And above all, in verse number 20, that goal to magnify Christ means that Paul says, I'm going to represent Christ in everything that I do. He even says that in verse number 20, whether it's by life or by dying. I don't even care if it's I live for the rest of these years here on the earth, for however long that is, I'm going to show you Jesus. And even if I die, I'm going to die like a Christian. I'm going to die the right way. I'm going to die, and death is going to be okay. It's a gain. It's just a boat to get me where I'm going. It's not the end, it's means to the end, is what Paul says. And I'm going to live like Jesus all the way, whether by life or by death. In verse number 21, he says, for me, I don't know about you, but for me, my choice, Paul says, is to live for Christ, and to die is gain. I want you to notice a couple of things about that statement that sticks out to me in verse number 21. First of all, notice the public nature of what Paul said. Like he puts it out there for everyone to see in verses 20 and 21. It's not a private goal that Paul had. Paul really did want to publicly represent Jesus. A good example of that is in Acts 17. When you see Paul standing up to these scholars, basically, and to these theologians, and he essentially just represents Christ, and he does so in a gracious and compassionate way. He doesn't hold back anything that's necessary. In fact, he tells them that I didn't shun to preach to you the whole counsel of God. Paul did say everything that he needed to say, everything that was necessary in order for them to have an understanding of Jesus Christ, but he did it in the right way. He represented Christ. Dare I say he represented Christ courageously, because you know how many of them there were and how many of him there were. He was severely outgunned, and it didn't matter. He still was willing to represent Jesus Christ. I'm telling you, there are some great challenges in Philippians 1, 18 through 21. That if your ultimate desire in life is to magnify Christ, and I pray that it is, I pray that that's my goal and that's what I'll cling to as long as I live on the earth, that there are three major ways that Paul exemplifies in his great character to magnify Jesus Christ. Can I rejoice in difficult circumstances? Can I rely on God completely when it seems like there's no way out? Or number three, will I be willing to represent Jesus Christ even when I might be the only one? Here's idea number 2 in the text as we look forward and we see the vision that Paul has. Not just that his desire is to magnify Jesus, but he knew that there was this future that was unfolding. Now, whether that future was here on the earth to live or it was to go to heaven, it didn't necessarily matter. Paul says, here's my vision. I want to be with Christ. If it is to live, I'll be with Christ. If it's to die, I'll be with Christ. And I think about maybe these exchanges that he would have been having with the guards in prison at this point. You know, it's like these guards come in, and he even says up in verse number, about 12, 13, and 14, that all the guards knew he was a Christian anyway. So they would have had conversations with Paul, or at least he would have been telling them about his faith in Jesus and his experience with God and the salvation. And I can just picture how those conversations would have gone with the guard. It's like, Paul, we're going to kill you if you keep talking about Jesus. Paul, if you keep saying these things about Jesus and telling other people about Jesus and getting people on your side to follow Jesus, if you keep doing this, we're going to kill you. And Paul says, that's great, fine, do it. I'll be with Jesus. It doesn't matter to me. You just kill me if you want to. And the guards are like scratching their heads and saying, well, on second thought, if it means that much to you, you can live. And he says, great, that's fine. I'm happy with that too because I still get to live for Jesus. It's a win-win for Paul. Why, though? Because of this vision. Look at verse number 22. If I live in the flesh, it means fruitful labor or work for me. And I don't know which one I should choose. I'm torn between the two. I long to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. Since I'm persuaded of this, I know that I will remain and continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that because of my coming to you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus may abound. Let's point out three things about Paul's vision here that might help us to have a vision of being with Christ. Here's number one, his problem. Okay, right there in the text he says, I'm in a strait betwixt the two, whatever that means in the King James Version, right? How many of you are still reading that one? A strait betwixt the two. Or he says, I'm stuck in the middle, basically. I can't decide. I don't know which way to go. I don't know what I want more. I want to go be with Jesus. That's what I really want to do. But I also really want to be here too. I want to stay here and keep serving you, church at Philippi, and the churches in Corinth and Galatia and Ephesus and Troas and everywhere else Paul would have gone on his missionary journeys. Those two things meant so much to him. And so it literally was a legit problem. A dilemma. And it's obvious that Paul is really struggling between the two. And he even says, I'm hard pressed, or I'm torn, or I'm pressured. There's actually only two other places in the New Testament that I found that this Greek word is used for hard pressed or torn in verse number 23. And it's in Luke 8:37 and Luke 8:45. I want you to listen to those. You don't have to turn over there. I can get there quicker on my iPad, right? I only got to press a few buttons. But listen to this as these words unfold. The people went out to see what happened. They came to Jesus and found the man the demons had departed from. I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong verse. Here you go. Then all the people of the Gerasene region asked him to leave them because they were gripped by great fear. So getting in the boat, he returned. That idea of gripped by great fear is the idea. In Luke chapter 8 and verse number 45, he says, "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds are hemming in and pressing against you." So in Luke 8 and verse number 37, it's gripped is the word. In Luke 8 and verse number 45, it's they're pressing against you. And so even then, that Greek word only used 3 times in the New Testament, it gives you this idea. It's a strong feeling of emotion that was really crowding in on Paul's heart of trying to make a decision. And we felt that before, haven't we? It doesn't necessarily even have to be a spiritual decision that we make. We felt like our hearts are overwhelmed. They're being crowded in or overpressured, or something's really causing our heart to feel overwhelmed because we have to make a decision. And those are the real emotions that Paul's feeling about living with Jesus or living here on the earth. We share that. We understand. But Paul says, I know this. Living is about Jesus. And dying is about Jesus. And I know that death is better. Being with Jesus, he says that dying for Jesus is far better. He understands that. But it's a win-win situation. It's kind of like if you said, Ty, do you want key lime pie or Dr. Pepper? Can't go wrong either way, right? It's a win-win situation. To live is Christ, Paul says, or to die is gain. That was his problem. He was stuck between the middle. Here's his preference, number 2, though. He tells us in verse 23 that he knows that departing to be with Christ is far better. And I guess I'm drawn to the fact that the first thing that Paul says, or at least that comes to his mind about dying, is not rewards. We sing, I want a mansion over the hilltop, and that's good. We talk about seeing all the things that we'll see when we get there. There's all kinds of country songs about the dirt roads in heaven and the fields and the fish and the ponds, and I'm sure that I've had conversations with some of my golf friends about how great the golf courses would be in heaven. All of those things we talk about all the time. But here's what I know. The first thing that came to Paul's mind about dying and going anywhere was to be with Jesus. That's it. That's what mattered more than anything to him. It wasn't about a mansion. It wasn't about any reward that he would gain, any benefit that he would get by being there. It was just that he wanted to be with Jesus, that he wanted to be closer to him, that he wanted to be in his presence. And sometimes we always talk about that, about what we get in heaven apart from Jesus. And I'm as guilty as anybody else, but that's what drew Paul to dying, was the fact that he just got to be with Jesus. When everything considered valuable in life is considered to be nothing in comparison to being with Jesus, you learn rather quickly that Jesus alone is worth living for. Here's number 3. Paul's problem, I'm stuck between the two. I long to be with Christ, but he says, this is my purpose. This is why I'm here. To remain in the flesh is more necessary. You need me, and I need you. Since I'm persuaded of this, I know that I'll remain and continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that because of my coming to you again, your boasting in Christ Jesus may abound. Even though Paul knew being with Jesus was better, he says, I've got a job here to do while I'm on the earth. There's an expectation for me to fulfill. There's a job that I've got to do, a responsibility that I have. And I wonder what gave Paul the confidence to say something like that, why Paul could say, I know that I still have work to do. He's in prison, right? I mean, in all likelihood, it doesn't look like he's getting out. And one historian or writer that I had read suggests that Rome had no actual reason to punish him. And so maybe that's why he thought eventually he would get out, because he was in prison on false grounds anyway. There wasn't anything that he had actually done wrong other than just being a Christian. And so they suggested that maybe Paul had the confidence to say, I still have work to do. I've still got a job to do, because he knew that they had no reason to hold him. But I believe it's more than that. I believe it's because he believed in God's power, that he believed that God could do anything. He had seen it, that God could do the impossible. Paul was a living testimony of the fact that God could do the impossible, and he believed that his purpose was to save others and to work and to help other people know Jesus, to serve for the progress and the joy of others. Verse number 25. He served so that other people could boast in Jesus Christ. And my question for you this morning is, do you? Do you serve? Do you exist? Do you live? Is that your purpose, so that you can serve Jesus and believe in the power that God has to get you through whatever it is you face? He would later say in Philippians 4 and verse 13, and we can all quote it very well, I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. Paul knew that. Do you? What about this? Do you serve so that other people will joy in the Lord or rejoice in the Lord or will serve the Lord? Do you exist for that purpose, to help other people do that, to enable them to do that? In fact, we're all priests. The Latin word for priest is bridge builder. Literally, they built bridges between the people and God. Do you? Here's question number 3. He says in verse number 26, I do this so that you can boast in Jesus Christ. Do you? Paul said to the church at Galatia in chapter 1 and verse number 10, I don't do these things to please men. I do this to please God. If I'm aiming to please men, why am I doing this, right? I'm doing this for Jesus. And that's what matters more than anything in the world to me. Everyone in the room today, I think, wants to live. I don't think any of us want to die. But I think some of us at least are okay, or at least we have accepted the fact that dying means that we get to go to heaven. But there's only one way. There's only one way to have a life worth living. There's only one way to have a death worth dying, and that is to completely entrust yourself to the one who lived a perfect life and conquered death. To magnify him in all that you do, whether by living or by dying. And that your vision, the one purpose, the one goal that fuels everything you do and everything you say and every moment that you exist, to believe with all your heart that the reason why we live and the reason why we die is to be with Jesus for eternity. If you're not a Christian this morning, that's not your reality. If there is no Christ in your life, there is no gain in your death. If you die today without Jesus, you are hopeless. You have nothing to live for. All of the words of encouragement that Paul gave to the church at Philippi, that's not your reality this morning if you don't have Jesus. If you've never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, there will be no gain in your death. You have an opportunity this morning to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, to be baptized for the remission of your sins, to be raised to have a new life, to be a new man. Paul talks about that so often, putting off the old man and putting on the new. You can do that this morning and make Christ your life and realize that death is only the beginning of the greatest experience you'll ever have, being in the presence of Jesus. Or maybe you are a Christian. Maybe somewhere along the lines you've lost sight of magnifying Him, because it's easy to do. We magnify so many things in our lives. Things are so important to us that we don't make Christ the object and the recipient of all the glory and praise that we give to things in our life. Why don't you recommit yourself to Him this morning? Why don't you make Him your purpose and renew that vision that you had to be with Jesus? Whatever it is your heart desires, you can come while we stand in